Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's ThinkIn on possibly the biggest subject that grips us at Tortoise, the question of how we're going to meet our responsibilities to our planet. How are we going to radically decarbonise, but at the same time meet human needs? And when we say human, we don't mean just ours, we mean the 7 billion to rising 9 billion population of this planet. And just to frame for you the conversation we hope we'll have over the course of this hour, our ambition at Tortoise is to understand what's driving the news, not to add to the breaking news, but there is a sense that you can do that in a way that informs ourselves of the issues, but also informs the debate of what some of the more constructive solutions might be to this problem. And so we chosen our words carefully this evening. Radical decarbonisation speaks to our own agenda. We are an impatient Tortoise newsroom. We're wondering, could you get there to net zero by 2035, 2040? How would you do that? But we're also worldly wise and acutely aware of the power gap, not least in the provision of energy and resources to everyone on the planet. And how do you make sure that you do that in a way that's fair? And I'm incredibly grateful that this evening we've got a really extraordinary group of people who can bring us a set of different perspectives on this subject. We're joined by Rachel Kite. If you're interested in this area, you are very excited by seeing Rachel Kite. She was the UN Special Representative on Sustainable Energy for All. But the really key thing is that Rachel is now the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts, and therefore is probably one of those people with a policy perch that can understand what's happening in the United States and how that might affect this agenda globally. Jan du Plessis is, I'm going to probably make Jan du Plessis blush, which is not an easy thing to do, but Jan du Plessis is not just the chair of BT Group, but the really key thing is Jan is one of those people that I first met talking actually about how do you take a big company and in fact, the corporate world to move rapidly to transform its own emissions and to encourage changes to consumer behavior. And then Lars Holmqvist, who at Tetra Pak is the person that I've found who, when you go through the weeds of all Tetra Pak's statements and documents about how they're transforming their own carbon footprint, and they're accelerating their change and have been doing so since 2002, well, the one thing that seems to be the common thread to it is you get Lars Holmqvist's name associated to all those statements. And so, Lars, I'm going to pitch you as more than just the VP of Packaging Solutions, but also one of the driving forces at the kind of global business that you're at in changing the way in which a packaging company can have a footprint on the planet. And then finally, Claire Perry O'Neill. Claire and I have got to know each other and work more and more together. She was the president designate of the COP, the gathering of COP26 that was due to have happened last week in Glasgow. It's thanks to Claire, in fact, that it was brought to the UK. It's been delayed, of course, by COVID, but that gives us a year to think about how we're going to meet this agenda. If you've never been to a ThinkIn before, then please know one key thing is it's an open conversation. It's not, even notwithstanding the grand wise owls that we've got for you this evening, it's not intended to be a moment where you will sort of sit quietly and wait on their wisdom. Really key is that everyone weighs in, shares their thoughts, makes contributions, and we have one very loosely enforced rule at Tortoise, which is we don't want your questions, we want your points of view, we want your opinion, your personal expertise and experience, because we think that will come and help us get to a better informed point of view ourselves. So do add up your thinking in the chat, do stick your blue digital hand up and I'll weave you into the conversation. But with that, if I might, I'm going to go to Rachel. Rachel, do you want to just give us a little political context before we get started? There's a lot of expectation now that actually we're going to see something very different out of the United States. We've seen the appointment of former Secretary of State John Kerry to be Joe Biden's climate czar. What do you think we can expect?
Hi, James. Hello, everybody. I think we have sort of game on in the race to zero, as the UK hosts of COP26 have called it, which is that following on from substantial announcements by the European Union, then China, Japan, and Republic of Korea over the last few weeks about large parts of the problem, as it were, large economies making a commitment to get to net zero. We now have the United States is now a president-elect who ran on a platform of getting to net zero as well, who's said that he will have usher in an energy system in the United States which is zero net carbon by 2035, has put forward a $2 trillion climate package, and which and is using climate to inform foreign policy and a sort of total government approach to climate, which is as it should be. And so it's not just the appointment of John Kerry as the climate czar, the international climate czar. I understand that there's going to be a sort of domestically focused climate czar as well, or pulling the government together around climate goals and actions and get that plan implemented. But it's Janet Yellen, who we've learned today is nominated to be Secretary to Treasury, extremely thoughtful, has written and observed a lot about climate change as a systemic or macro critical risk to the global economy when she was at the Fed. And then you see in the foreign policy team that's been appointed, every one of them is, well, first of all, extremely well qualified for their jobs, but all of them have grappled with climate change to date and are able to lead agenda. So I think the US is in, it's all the way in, and John Kerry's job is to reestablish some trust with the international community and join that race with the European Union and with China.
And Rachel, I know we've spoken before about the funding of decarbonisation, and previously about what the multilateral institutions or agreements will be to make that happen. I see they appointed Tony Blinken, or they've nominated Tony Blinken to state. He's seen as a person who's going to back alliances. The question I've got really is, if you wanted to advance an agenda for radical decarbonisation and you wanted to find multilateral ways of funding that, which institution would you go to? How would you make it happen?
Well, so I think that the United States sits as a very important shareholder, very important owner and voice on all of the multilateral instruments that we have today, that we've been living with for more than 70 years. At the moment, we've got very strong leadership coming out of the International Monetary Fund under Kristalina Georgieva, with Gita Gopinath as the chief economist and others there, who are turning the rhetoric of macrocritical risk, macroprudential risk into, well, what does this mean? And especially saying that there's one story in town, which is how do we recover from COVID in such a way as we radically decarbonize and build more inclusive economies. So the IMF's already there, and having the US as a benign and positive force in their ownership will be very important, because it helps us get to issues of how to deal with debt and decarbonization at the same time. Last week, there was a big event in Paris, this finance summit of all the biggest ever gathering of public development financial institutions. The World Bank played a very quiet backseat role, did not come through, did not argue for a strong statement coming out of that meeting. And lots of eyes were watching, well, what is the World Bank doing? I think you now have a Biden administration that's going to come in and make very clear that it wants all of the multilateral development banks to be using their resources in a positive way. So I think that there are domestic tools that are important. Janet Yellen has to rebuild the Treasury sort of approach to things, has to rebuild a very aggressive stance on climate. We need new leadership at the Securities and Exchanges Commission. There's a lot that has to be done domestically, but this foreign policy team can engage. We can have an international department on energy and environment at the Treasury, which we used to have, and which was basically defenestrated over the last few years. So I think they'll be backed multilaterally and they'll be backed bilaterally.
Oh, Rachel, I mean, by the way, it's a lovely note on which to start. I can't remember a conversation around this that has started with such a sense of momentum, or potential at least, around the politics on this. I'm going to come in a moment to Claire Perry O'Neill on COP and what we should expect. And by the way, I am alive to the conversation that's going on in the chat about the extent to which we focus on our planet or the extent to which we focus on people on our planet. I hope I can come to a few on those. And even while we were talking, Rachel, I saw that Tamara Gray was asking the extent to which the Capitol Hill is going to act as a brake on all of this. But if I might, I'd like to go to Jan, because Jan, I talked in introducing you as someone who's cared for a long time and is sort of personally passionate about this subject. I'm interested to know, when you move into a business as you move in as a chair of a company of the scale of BT, when you look at BT's footprint, when you start to think about its Scope 3 emissions, whether you find that actually it's quite difficult to make radical changes to its carbon emissions.
Yeah, James, look, firstly, can I say quickly, look, I feel quite honored to have been asked to serve on a panel where there are some real experts on the topic, because as I said to you last week, I am certainly not an expert. And quite honestly, why am I here? I want to say firstly, I'm here because I am just an ordinary citizen of the world, where actually, the older I become, the more I look at the mess we're causing around us, the more I'm concerned about what we're doing to this planet. That's why I'm here. And secondly, yeah, I'm chairman of a company which has a huge carbon footprint, but at the same time has, I think, an excellent track record of what we have done, but a big remaining problem left. And I would like to spend a few moments in pretty open terms discussing our achievements, but our problems. But before I do that, I thought I might make a general comment which responds to one of the things I picked up in the chat already. And I think in the spirit of the ThinkIn as being a forum for civilized disagreement, might I say that in a pre-read tonight, because I read this before we came online, I thought to myself, hang on, what you're saying is you're discussing apparently the need to overall business as usual for the sake of forests, oceans, and the atmosphere, and the need to strike a balance between people, the needs of people and the needs of the planet. I thought, wow, that's not how I see it, I'm afraid to say, because the suggestion cannot surely be that we can continue to sort of destroy our forests, pollute our oceans, spew unlimited quantities of carbon into the atmosphere, and that somehow, if that's what people want, we're okay. Because surely the most elementary analysis of the interdependence of humans with the planet suggests that's not how it is. So I would prefer to rephrase your thinking to simply say, yes, there's a trade-off to be discussed between the humans on this planet today and the needs of those who come after us, our grandchildren and those who come after that, because ultimately there is no choice between planet or people. It's not the way I see it. Now, I suspect, James, is not what you meant, but I think it's what you wrote. So I'll just leave the thought there. But a few of the people in the chat had already made the point.
Yes.
So quickly on BT, look, I think firstly, people may be surprised to know that as a company, we have a very significant carbon footprint, which I've got to acknowledge up front. Because the nature of the ICT business is very energy intensive. And therefore, there's a reason why many years ago we figured we've got to do something about it. Now, I'm pleased to say that already in 1992, 28 years ago, long before it became fashionable, BT as a company was one of the first companies in the world to set carbon reduction targets for itself, way back when. And in 2008, we published for the first time properly science-based targets of what we wanted to do. And 8 years later, 4 years before our 2020 target, we had reduced our carbon emissions intensity by 80%. Now, I won't give you more stats to blow our trumpet, but I think we've done some good things. So that's background. But if I touch on two practical areas, the first is the nature of the business. We as a company are one of the largest consumers of electricity in the UK, consuming 1% of all the electricity generated by the UK national grid. That is absolutely huge. And it's not just because we've got thousands of exchanges and other buildings across the UK, but it's because our networks, and as well as our data centers, are very energy intensive. And that is why we decided many years ago it's not acceptable to have that kind of footprint. Now, the fix to some extent, I'm saying this deliberately, was easy. We have for some years been buying all our electricity from renewable sources. And I'm pleased to say, in the UK, I should say, I'm pleased to say that this year, for the first time, we've managed to enter into contracts with suppliers all around the world, so that as of this year, all our electricity around the world is bought from renewable sources. And one more point on that is, however, it's relatively easy, if you wish, to buy stuff from renewable sources. But the question is still, so what are you doing about it? We are spending almost £50 million a year just on energy saving initiatives. Not just because it's good for the planet, because actually if you can use less energy, you're saving money, so it's good for the bottom line. Now, the final topic I want to pause on for the moment, because we can come back to some of the stuff later. We have a remaining problem, which is how are we going to decarbonize our vehicle fleet? Because BT, together with Openreach, have the second largest commercial fleet in the UK, with 33,000 vehicles driving around the country every day of the week. And we are absolutely committed to do something about it, but it's hard to do it on our own. What we have said we will do without help, we will by the mid-2020s make sure that a third of those vehicles are electric vehicles. We are going to do that. But after that, it becomes tough. Because
and Jan, can I just ask you, that's not presumably an investment problem. Is that a charging and infrastructure?
It's two things, James. The one is charging and infrastructure. 60% of our people who drive our fleet go home at night and they park up the vehicle outside their homes. And in many, many instances, they simply don't have the facility overnight to charge their vehicle. So the question of a charging infrastructure is absolutely critical. We will use that if it's available, but that's going to require government intervention. The second thing is to be awfully practical. A lot of our vehicles are large and there are simply no EVs available today who can do that.
Right.
So I'm really pleased to say that we're going to use the full weight of our influence to drive change. So in June of this year, we combined with the climate group to launch a new initiative that we call the UK Electric Fleets Coalition. This coalition now has 29 companies in the UK. Between us, we have something like half a million commercial vehicles on the road every day. And we're going to do two things. We're going to pressurize government to bring in enabling legislation and regulation to enable those who so wish to make available the charging infrastructure we need. And secondly, we are collectively going to use all our influence with vehicle manufacturers to convince them that what we need are commercial vehicles, often large commercial vehicles that we all need in order to be able to make the transition. So we will do what we can, but we need help.
So Jan, I want to come back to that. I'm going to bring in Lars and then Claire in a moment, not least because I think one of the really interesting things about this year is the forcing mechanism of the COP to give ourselves a to-do list. So I'd love to come back to that. And also, by the way, I've seen some people asking, well, what about hydrogen? Could that be used for some of your large vehicles? I want to come back to that too. But Lars, can I bring you in first? The funny thing is, when we started talking about this, and we've started this conversation with Tetra Pak because we know you're sort of seized by this particular agenda too. The truth is, when we first talked about it, I had this rather naive thought, which was, you know what? The energy sector is getting clobbered on climate change. There's a temptation, surely, if you're in the packaging and materials business, to keep your head down and do your business rather than weigh in. But I assume that there is a good deal of public pressure in around packaging and materials. And I just wondered whether you could talk through what the issues are, like where they sit between pollution and litter, carbon footprint, and how you see your way through to resolving them.
No, certainly. Thanks, James. I mean, first of all, I represent the food and beverage industry. We are part of the food and beverage industry, and it's really critical for the food and beverage industry, first of all, never mind packaging, to meet two goals, really. One is to ensure food safety and food availability all around the world. That's the food and beverage industry. That's what we're about. But at the same time, minimize the impact on the planet and the limited resources that it carries. So it's not really an either or situation here. We need to balance both these requirements and they're fundamental to our sustainable future. But really, coming back to the climate emergency that we are facing, rapid decarbonization, as you call it, is really the need of the hour, the way we see it. And circularity, so collection and recycling and the circular economy, is definitely a part of that solution, because it keeps materials in use and reduces the environmental impact. That's clear. But it's only really part of the answer, because given the limited infrastructure that is there in many parts of the world, and you know, it's not there to take on full circularity. So a more comprehensive approach that we believe in, it is to look at the full life cycle. So focus on decarbonizing the products as well as the operations. So the products being the packaging, but also the equipment that is used to package and process food. And in doing so, we have, I would say, two strong levers, if I can say.
Yeah.
First of all is to use and replace the high climate impact materials that may be in our operation with low carbon materials, right? So renewable resources and plant and paper-based materials. And that is really what we're driving. And secondly is, of course, to decarbonize the energy that we use and focus on improving energy efficiency and rapidly switch to renewable energy alternatives. So that's how we approach it, James.
And Lars, can I just ask about this circularity point, right? I remember we had a conversation like this with Ellen MacArthur, you know, the sailor. And it's so seductive, the idea of circularity. But when you get into the detail of it, it feels as though it can only do a certain percentage of the work in terms of dealing with footprint. When you imagine the best possible result in the 2020s in improving, you know, circular use of materials, what should our ambition be?
Well, I think, as you said, today we're not there, right? All around the world, we don't have, let's say, perfect collection, perfect recycling schemes to create that circularity. But we need to go there. That is the end goal, to try to create that circularity. And that is why, you know, in Tetra Pak, we are really conscious of the role that we need to play here. So we are focusing on improving collection and recycling all over the world, together with key stakeholders, together with the communities, together with governments, because that is absolutely key to create a circular environment. But we need to be realists. We know that there is still not circular options for everyone, whether it is collection or recycling. And that is where it's absolutely critical to focus on the minimum impact that we can have on the planet, on the environment. And that is where decarbonization comes in.
And Lars, can I ask you? We had a conversation with Alan Jope, who runs Unilever, the other day, and he was talking about the carbon footprint of a company like Unilever. Funnily enough, he was saying the biggest issue actually is the use of hot water. They're in the shampoo business. Actually, it's how people warm their water that is probably the biggest emissions issue. You know, when I listen to Jan talk about, okay, we've made these changes on renewables, or you talk about changing the materials you use in your packaging, I wonder whether we're being too easy on you, in that weirdly the stuff that's in your own supply, in your own manufacturing process, are actually easy to change. The real demand that we should make of you is no, make changes through your whole supply chain, make changes through consumer behavior. And I wonder how you would think about those two issues, sort of upstream and downstream from Tetra Pak.
It's a very good question, James, and it is of course the focus of our company to make sure that we not only focus on decarbonizing our own operation, which we have committed to do by 2030, so that we will be carbon neutral by 2030. But as you said, most importantly, suppliers and upstream, as well as the full value chain, which we also have a vision to have completely carbon neutral by 2050. And we have a major role to play here. We are, of course, part of the problem, but we are also determined to lead the sustainability transformation of our industry. And we are really on a journey to create the world's most sustainable food package, which is really made solely from, you know, responsibly sourced, renewable or recycled material. is fully recyclable, carbon neutral, and allowing for the ambient distribution, which, by the way, protects food products throughout the value chain with a very low carbon footprint because it doesn't need to be chilled. And as I said, it comes with a commitment of our own operation to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions, but also using 100% renewable electricity and with the ambition, as I said, to achieve a net zero greenhouse gas emission for the entire value chain in which we operate latest by 2050. And these are really integral part of our brand promise, what we stand for, which is to protect what's good, which is all about food availability, food safety, about people, as you talked about today, and about the planet. So protect what's good for food, people, and planet.
So, Lars, thank you. I'm just gonna come to Claire, because partly Claire, because when I listened to this, I sort of wish that COP26 was going to do all of these things. It was going to, I see Andrew Girdwood making the argument for, punitive fines on companies that don't meet their emissions targets, or both Jan and Lars talking about the extent to which there can be help to transform networks. But I might be completely barking up the wrong tree here with COP, aren't I? In that it's not going to be a fix-all summit. So
no, well, let me give
what it is. Yeah, that'd be great.
Let me give people just a little bit of history about COP, because what COP is an extraordinary moment, a forcing moment, a focus moment in the world's climate calendar. And so many of these conversations come to a point of a tentpole moment, if you like, when we have the COPs. And of course, with the UK COP, it's become, one of the government's kind of detoxifying calling cards in the post-Brexit environment. And actually, that's a very, very good thing, because with the spending taps on, we were able to drive some really serious investment into COP. But the COP started after the Rio Earth Summit in 1991, where the world basically said, how are we going to sustainably develop our economies? And it was set up simply as an intergovernmental process governed by the UN. It was, like all UN processes, focused primarily on negotiating a text. This is what happens. Basically, you sit around for 2 weeks and you come out with a text, a communique. And the parties, COP stands for Conference of the Parties. The parties are those countries that originally signed the framework agreement that governs this. It's not a treaty. It has no international binding legal obligations under it. And it was modeled on the Montreal Agreement, which some of us old people will remember was set up when the world was facing the crisis of the ozone hole being removed by uncontrolled emissions of chlorofluorocarbons. And the Montreal Agreement was a great thing. Governments came together. They said, this is very bad. We can do this. We agree we're going to phase them out of our manufacturing processes. And the good thing about that was there were alternatives for CFCs, and no economy was particularly dependent on the manufacture of refrigeration product, which was actually what was really driving CFCs. The challenge with decarbonisation is you're asking countries to do materially difficult things with their energy supply, with their taxes, with their public spending, with their citizens' rights in some cases. And as an ex and recovering politician, these are really hard things for governments to do. And in particular, ministers show up at the COP for 5 seconds, get whisked around and disappear again. The power lies with the negotiators, who are civil servants who've been doing it for years and years, and who frankly negotiate on a zero-sum basis. And actually, James, the reason they do that is in the title of tonight's talk, because to decarbonise and maintain or improve living standards for billions of people is very difficult for many countries to do. And so our priorities in the northwestern bit of the global hemisphere are not the same as those of the developing South, and that has been a real problem. A zero-sum basis means, by the way, that there's one pie and we're going to divide it up amongst ourselves, and the aim is to fight for the biggest share. But James, just to say, to focus on the Paris Agreement for the moment, which was the absolute high point of international diplomacy, the French did something extraordinary. Not only did they herd all those cats into one space where there was one agreement about an outcome, which is the World can't warm up beyond 2 degrees because that will be highly dangerous. They also introduced 2 other things, apart from the government. They introduced the concept of action in the states, and they introduced the concept of financing this. And
Right.
that has increasingly been where all the excitement and the interest is, because actually the corporate sector is represented very well today by Jan and Lars, and the financial sector are responding much more rapidly in terms of their commitments and their governance and their investment than many governments around the world. So COP now has this multifaceted thing. At the heart of it, none of that stuff matters. All that matters is the signal, you know, this negotiation. But it's become a way to express this extraordinary ambition and momentum that is developing in the world around this climate agenda.
And Claire, just tell me, because when you were planning, when you were bringing it up to the UK and you were beginning to plan for it, I worry that we're in a bit of a mental mess around climate, in that people want Glasgow to do everything. And I just want to get a sense of what happens inside the COP process and what's reasonable to expect around it.
Well, so we should expect this COP, regardless of what happens in the negotiating halls, to be a massive moment of truth about where we're going, what the climate trajectory is, and what we're going to do about it. The truth of the matter is this, James. I sat in the Madrid COP all the way through, the last one we had because we lost a year. We had 500,000 people protesting in Madrid, pleading with us to take action now. I sat in a meeting with the whole negotiating plenary where the topic of debate was what was the title of the meeting we were in. For that room, the level of ambition and action expressed outside it has very little meaning. And it's not to say it's not a valuable process, because ultimately you have to have some structural framework to bring people together. But the more we can do with companies, with the financial system, with our own governments expressed through the ballot box, the more we will have a chance to influence this actual outcome. And I'm afraid to say that the tragedy of all of this is, you know, since the first Rio Earth Summit, emissions from energy are up over 50%. People may have seen the International Meteorological Organization report yesterday. We all thought COVID, you know, look, this is the future, demand collapsed. We emptied the planes, we all stopped traveling. Guess what? It hasn't even registered. Nothing in the daily graphs. And so we have got to do something which we know very dramatically different. And the COP, of course, is this focusing moment. It's a moment where we can come together. But the internal negotiations, it's great that we'll have these net zero pledges. None of them are legally binding, not one.
Yes.
And so to this question about can you sue governments who miss their pledges, we don't have a framework to do that. It's not to say they're not incredibly important, but the governments, I'm afraid, as Ronald Reagan said, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I take that with a big pinch of salt when it comes to the climate agenda. We are all in this, and particularly the corporate sector, because an average CEO stays in place for 8 years. The average prime minister, 4. I've been a politician, knocking on doors and saying we'd like to basically, you know, reduce your level of flying, and by the way, you may have to pay more for your energy, which isn't the truth now, because in many countries renewables are cheaper, is not the way politicians get re-elected. So we're going to have to work on all fronts.
I'm going to, can I, Claire, I want to just bring in a few people, and I can see Jan wanted to come back in on something, and I saw Rachel did too. But can I start with Vinay Gupta, because I think Vinay, as well as doing a number of great things for us. One is you wrote a brilliant book for us on futures, or with us, which was great. But secondly, you've been giving a sort of stream of data as this conversation's been going about emissions. But on the basis that no good deed goes unpunished, Vinay, can I just say, you've made this point in the chat, which is, look, there's only one of 2 options here, either a radical technological breakthrough or a fundamental change in our way of lives. And do you want to just spell that out? Because personally, I'm not sure I buy that as the way of handling this, but I just wanted to hear why you come to that view.
So, I mean, this is basically an arithmetic problem, right? It's an arithmetic thing. So, you know, you start with this consideration of how much carbon can we really emit. So every year, the Earth soaks about 2 tons of carbon per person. Emissions above that go on our kind of global credit card. And when the global credit card hits somewhere between 150 billion tons and 600 billion tons, agriculture collapses and billions of people starve and the whole thing turns into a hell realm, right? That's the situation. So UK consumption is currently about 3 times sustainable levels. American consumption is about 6 times. India is bang on sustainable consumption right now. And at that point, we're screwed. You're either going to consume.
But no, I think, but hold on, but Vinny, hold on, sorry, forgive me for interrupting. Because I think everyone by definition of spending this evening on this call is gripped by the problem, right? I don't think anyone is, it's not a group of people who don't see the problem. The argument is now between, and even in the chat you can see it, is between those people who say, you've got to give up cars, you've got to give up this way of life, you've got to give up this level of consumption, and others who say, that's just not going to happen. And also it's not fair on people who haven't had the lifestyles and lifestyle opportunities we've had.
History doesn't care about fair, right? What we're dealing with is something which makes the Second World War look like a firework, right? The death tolls from climate change could easily reach 500 million people. And almost all of the people that die will be African, Indian, South American. It won't happen in Europe and it won't happen in America, because generally speaking, the developed countries have relatively temperate climates, and it's the very, very hot, very poor countries where you're going to get the enormous exterminations. Right?
So you're saying, but just Phoenix, sorry to press you. So are you saying that actually the only way you get through this is that you do force fundamental changes to people's living standards?
Let's really drill this down, right? Your carbon footprint probably right now is something like 6 or 8 tons. You've got to get to 2 tons or you're destroying the future of humanity. So how are you going to get your personal footprint down by 3/4? You're either going to do new technology, solar panels, meat without animal-less meat products. You're either going to re-engineer all the stuff that you use in your lifestyle to get your numbers way down, or you're just going to stop 3/4 of your activities.
Right.
So those are your only choices. There is no other path. The numbers have to come down. We either stop doing stuff or we do stuff without putting carbon into the atmosphere. Those are our only choices.
Well, Vinny, thank you. All right, thank you for making the case as strongly as that. Yeah, and I saw that you wanted to come back, and then I'm going to bring in Judith Patton, if I might, on hydrogen.
Just very quickly, if I can pick up something Claire said, I think first of all, look, I think I agree with Claire that I think for the first time in the last year or 18 months, as recent as that, I have noticed a real change in the thinking of those who supply capital to the world's business, both in debt finance and equity finance. It's a real change. And I'm an old cynic. I'm telling you this is real. I can smell it wherever I go. So that's really, really positive, because that's one way whereby businesses will over time be coerced into changing behavior. Secondly, I'd like to say, look, we don't perhaps, I think one of the problems, of course, is in the supply chain of all these companies, including the tech space, the suppliers, the people who make iPhones, iPads, all the stuff that we sell, big issue. But I want to come back to the role of government. And I'm sorry to say, I think Claire, thankfully, will prefer to be called tonight as an ex-politician rather than a politician. I have sympathy with the job of governments, but they're fundamentally dishonest. And I'm not talking just about our government, I'm talking everywhere. They are great at painting pictures about achievements by the 2030s and the 35s and all what we're going to do in the future. They consistently refuse to do the things that are deeply unpopular today. So, for example, in the UK, why many years ago we stopped with what used to be called the fuel price escalator to try and discourage the use of diesel and petrol? Because it's politically unpopular. Why do we not tax the consumption of gas in domestic heating? Because it is obvious we have to decarbonize domestic heating and switch people eventually towards electrification with the possibility of renewables. Why? Because it's politically deeply unpopular. And I understand that. But until governments are prepared to make unpopular choices, there's a limit to what people achieve. And ultimately, therefore, it's going to have to come through the ballot box.
But and Jan, though, can I just pick up one thing, though? Historically, you have not had the chairs of FTSE 100 companies or chief execs advocating, new burdens on consumers like carbon pricing or new forms of taxation that might, add to the cost of business. The business world itself owns some of the responsibility for this, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And look, I'm the first one to admit my views today have changed from what they were 15, 20 years ago, but that's fine. Let's not live in the past. As of today, I speak for myself. I have no doubt that we have a huge problem. And many people I speak to, basically old chairmen like me or chairwomen like me, feel the same. So I'm not in isolation in the world of business. Many other business leaders feel the same. We've got to do something. We want to do something. I'm simply saying some of this stuff, James, will require government intervention. And until such time as they're prepared to do that, we are going to struggle.
So, can I just bring in, I'm sure, Claire, you may want to come back to, I see Lars nodding, so I'm going to come back to him in a moment too. But can I just see Judith Patton? I've known Judith for a long time, and for a long time we've talked about oil and gas, and now I see you wired or fired up by hydrogen, and particularly in regard to this point about sort of heavy goods vehicles and hydrogen. My colleague Giles Whittell is really the person to talk to about this, but tell me what you think is feasible in a realistic time frame, i.e. the next decade, Judith.
Good heavens above, you don't ask too much for somebody just wrote a few things in the chat box, James. Oh, lordy. Well, I've just come actually from another webinar given by the woman who runs Ulemco, which is a company that takes bog standard heavy duty vehicles and actually changes them, not by magic, but by engineering, into hydrogen vehicles. And you have, for example, at the moment, next week, apparently, work starts on Glasgow's Grishas, which in the summer months will be food refuse collection vehicles. Mm-hmm. But slowly, the whole thing is that huge vehicles would, if you have them as pure electric, will take an age to refuel. Obviously, if they're filled with hydrogen, it is the same sort of behavior as we have now, and that's important. And the woman on this, Amanda, on this webinar was talking about ambulance fleets that have already been switched to hydrogen. Right. In that, they're needed urgently. They can't possibly just go away and say, sorry, filling up at the moment, be with you in an hour or two. So that hydrogen has the immediacy. Now, she came out with all manner of facts and figures, and if I had hours to look through the notes that I've scribbled here, I could give you timescales. She certainly was looking at what can be done in the relatively short term.
Yes.
And needing dramatic change by 2030. I mean, everybody is talking about the need for dramatic change by 2030, but speed and scale has to be important. It's not just as fiddling around at the edge. We really, really have to change things now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, by the way, as you were talking, Judith, Charlie Curtis in the chat has just sort of, I think, kind of enumerated the point that Jan was making too, which is there is something tipping in the mix between government and business, and obviously the public. We are following up on hydrogen. As I say, Giles Whittell has written a lot for us, and if you go on the Tortoise website, you can see a lot of examination of what the possibilities, but also the problems with hydrogen, the hydrogen are. I just wanted to bring, to come, if I might, to Mark Breen, just because, Mark, you touched on the food waste question, and I know Lars was talking a little bit about kind of responsibility to make sure food arrived safely and it wasn't wasted, but you had some amazing numbers about food waste and the climate emissions, or the carbon emissions associated with it. Yeah. Will you just talk us through that? Hello.
Yeah, very briefly. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to be brought in, so that was a bit of a shock to me. I think it's an FAO stat that 8% of carbon emissions are caused by food waste, and if that was a state, that would be third in line behind America and China. And so there's a bit of discussion going on in the chat there. And immediately consumers think, well, the supermarkets need to sort it out, the producers need to sort it out. But actually, there needs to be ways to support people and move the knowledge gap forwards, because 71% of food waste takes place in the home. Yeah, that's about all.
It's actually fun enough, Mark. We had. Have you come across Dave Lewis, who was the chief executive of Tesco and is now World Wildlife Fund? He's I think it's fair to say, obsessed by this issue and the carbon footprint of food waste. And actually, if I might, before I go back to Claire, I just want to ask Lars about this, because Lars, you know, the truth is, if you look at the chat, you can see there's this range of opinion around, particularly what business does, i.e. whether you trust business, whether you take it seriously, whether you think it's kind of marking its own homework in terms of delivery on climate. But at the same time, you're also seeing discussion like this, issues around how do you make sure that food is delivered, hygienically and safely to people. How do you communicate this in a way that you think you can have, A, the confidence of the public, but also credibility with, policymakers and government? How do you do this in such a way they don't say, oh, well, they would say that, wouldn't they?
Well, it is a good question, and I think it's a question for any corporation. I think what we need to do is to talk about facts and talk about data. And if you look today, and I'm very happy that this question on food waste came up, because if you look at the data, we know that food and food production, but food waste has a big impact on the climate and the carbon emissions. And so if we talk about data, let's say 30% of all food today is wasted. And we in the food and beverage industry, and specifically when you have aseptic packaging technology, we know that every package, let's say, that we can package safely without preservatives, without refrigeration, that lasts for 1 year, can be distributed to all corners of the world, regardless of the infrastructure, the roads, the heat, and so on, and be consumed, safely within at least a year, and all of that with minimizing the food waste and the footprint, the carbon footprint along the. So if we talk about it in those terms, I believe that by talking about it in those terms and adding facts and examples of how we contribute, we are part of the problem, there's no doubt, but we're also part of the solution. And with a lot of facts and data throughout the value chain, I think that's the best chance we have to be credible.
And Lars, forgive me, how do you do it? Because the reality is, most of us, when you hear Jan, you realize, oh, the BT emissions problem is not what you immediately think. It's 33,000 vehicles. The reality is most of us are not going to know the ins and outs of the making of, Tetra Pak materials, not going to know your supply chains. What is a confidence building way of having scrutiny of what you do and the way you're making changes that people like us can say, okay, well, they pledged to do X, they're really delivering, or they've fallen 20% short. How do we do that in a way that we've got some, not just quote unquote transparency, i.e. we hear what you say, but kind of measurable transparency, measurable improvement?
Well, I think we need to break down, of course, the commitments that we have into measurable, very measurable targets, and not just the 10-year or 20 or 30-year visions that we have. And we've done that, and to translate those into something that is understandable by consumers, which is the carbon footprint of what they consume, versus the alternatives that they have. I think that is the best way to create that credibility. And we work a lot with our partners in the value chain, be it the food brands or the retailers, in order to convey these, again, with facts. This is the option that I have. This is the carbon footprint that I have with my decision, with the option that I've chosen. So I really believe that it is with facts. And I just took an example of consumers, but throughout the value chain.
Lars, thank you. I'm going to bring in Rachel Swaby, if I might. Rachel, I'm bringing you in but partly because I love the comment on, I'm a member of the Green Party, I
Yeah.
haven't voted for them
I
because
like
of first
that.
past the post. I also have to tell you that I've got a fair few members of my family
Yeah.
that not only are Green Party members, one of them stood against Claire.
Me. The greenest Tory ever.
But Rachel, what do you make of this, the conversation, if I can caricature it, between those people who think, look, there is a deliverable transition here that business, consumers, governments can participate in, and we can deliver on time. And those people, and forgive me, Vine, for kind of caricaturing it, say, no, we're going to have a fundamental handbrake turn in the way we live in order for that to work. I don't know, Rachel, whether you can join us. What do you think?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but I'm not sure we can see you.
I don't think you can see me because my camera does this every once in a while, and it.
Your camera's protecting your anonymity, Rachel. But what's your view?
It is not in any way deliberately.
So where do you stand though on the? Do you know my question really, which is there's a transition here that's deliverable versus there's a revolution that's necessary.
Yes, I think I'd probably come down on the second side, to be honest. I just don't see how an economic system that's built on growth, continual growth, that has basically reached the limits of that growth, can continue. When it's pushing an immovable boundary.
All right. Well, Claire, can I come? Having defeated one member of the Green Party in politics, I'd like just to take on Rachel, because I suspect that although most people don't like the idea of changing that radically themselves, that when push comes to shove, they think that that's what this is going to take. And I wondered, having thought about it more than most, what you make of it.
Well, I think so. There's a sort of debate about, is it sort of either or, and what's the magic bullet? And I guess I've realised it's both and there will be technological leaps that absolutely help us. And hydrogen is, where we are on hydrogen is where we were on renewables 15 years ago in terms of potential, in terms of excitement, also in terms of opportunity to make really expensive mistakes with other people's money, which government's very good at. But I think there is a huge opportunity to use hydrogen. By the way, the thing we never talk about is not, home heating and flying. We never talk about the fact that we have no alternative production capabilities right now for steel. I mean, yes, we have a couple of pilots, or for cement, or for the stuff that actually is the building blocks of the global economy. And to this very important point Rachel makes about the limits of growth, you're absolutely right, but we still have countries, and I think this was mentioned in the setup, who are saying, well, hang on, we would like our citizens to have 24/7 access to electricity so young women can go to school and people can study in the evenings. And and it's our right to have that. And you cannot sit there in your world where you've depleted all the resources and tell us we can't have it. And I find that, an argument that is never made enough in many of these conversations. But so I think there is just a very big pivot that has to happen in everything. And that feels quite grim for a lot of people. But actually, one of the things the Green Party has done very well, and I think this has become mainstream, is to focus on the opportunities from this. So not only the jobs. I mean, if you want to see what what is happening with the offshore wind industry, go to Grimsby, go to Great Yarmouth, have a look at what this brand new industry is doing to forlorn coastal communities in terms of real job, real skills, real manufacturing. Think about the fact that this 10-point green plan, which is great, says we're going to have another 250,000 jobs. That's tiny. We should have 2 million green jobs. And also, there's something about the connection with nature. I mean, maybe it's just I've been locked down in the middle of the Wiltshire countryside in my old constituency, but there is something very powerful about people's desire to reconnect with a better, healthier way of life, to think more mindfully about what they eat, to value other things. And I think those are points the Green Party has made very successfully, and they're actually really resonating people. And this is, I believe, why so many companies are on the transition, because you know what, CEOs are people too, and they have kids and they have grandchildren, and there is a sense of, we've kind of really stressed the world I believe very strongly in the power of capitalism to generate prosperity, but I also believe in the power of well-regulated markets and companies to do good. And so there's something about that powerful Green Party narrative that I actually find very compelling. And I think a lot of people increasingly feel that, even if they don't vote for them at the ballot box.
Well,
and by the way, James, your brother-in-law said he would have voted for me if he hadn't been standing as a Green Party member.
Well, I hope you won't tell the Green Party that, Claire. I'm really aware of the time. I want to, if I could, I just wanted to flag up, I thought Daniel Johnson's point, I'm not going to have the chance to invite him in, but he says the case for a 2030 target for decarbonisation is that it gives more time for developing countries to keep on emitting and keep on growing. We owe it to the rest of the world to slow down, pause and redistribute our enormous wealth more equally instead of continuing to grow unsustainably as a short-term medicine. This question about kind of global equity in this seems to me a massive one. And I wanted just to come back to Rachel, if I might, Rachel. I'm sorry, there's been such a kind of overwhelming kind of waterfall of ideas and thoughts in this conversation. But what do you think about this point, which is, you know, the West gets an agenda on around net zero just at the moment that much of the rest of the world is growing and catching up in terms of economic and social opportunities. How do you do this in a way that it's fair?
Well, so the net zero sort of by mid-century, that's an aggregate that the developed world needs to get to net zero as quickly as possible in order to allow countries with greater journeys of development to go through, still to continue on, to be able to get there as well, right? So, you know, it isn't, I mean, it should be 2040 or as early as possible for the developed world. And it's, you know, China's coming at 2060 and others will get there when they can. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think the conversation has been evolved by the fact that it doesn't have to be this conversation around sacrifice, which really sort of lands very heavily and sort of dead on arrival, you know, with most people, because you need to be able to aspire to being able to protect your own family, your own country, being able to protect the futures for your children. So what's possible is that there is a pathway to development, which isn't about going through the fossil fuel soaked economic model that we went through in the developed world. And there's a fairness in there, which I'll come to in a second, but you know, that is now possible. So it is possible to use gas as a bridge, to go to renewables, to be able to close the energy access gap. We're not going to do it by building coal-fired power stations and then transmission lines, which only transmit 40% of electricity, and then, you know, having, you know, very badly managed utilities. We're going to do that by a mix of off-grid, mini-grid, you know, smart grids, and the investment for that, I think that's the challenge, is getting the investment into that future and changing the mindset, the inertia, as well as the incumbency that we have. So this is not impossible to do, but it will require time and a substantially different model of development and assistance from the North. And then just back to the fairness is really about the fact that many countries didn't cause this problem, and yet they are the most vulnerable to the already extraordinary impacts of climate change, whether it's extreme weather events, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's disruptions to food systems as a result, whether it's migration and the fact that most migrants are actually being housed in poor countries, not knocking on the doors of the EU, etc. So there's the fairness, and that's the conversation that the COP has not really ever been able to have, and it's probably the wrong place for it.
Rachel, sorry, just explain what you mean.
Well, so I mean, you know, in a different discussion which wouldn't be titled climate, this would be discussed as reparations. You know, what is the rich world going to do to make sure that there is sufficient funding and support and technical advice and help to those countries who have to make a transition, who have to build their resilience, to impacts which are happening now and will only get worse over the next 20 years when they didn't cause the problem and they have very constrained resources. And that's at the heart of the African proposal around the Europe purchasing their debt and allowing them to be able to move onto a greener pathway. That's at the heart of what we call loss and damage in climate negotiations, but it's really a conversation about what are we going to do to help them make the transition. It isn't that we're going to help them do follow the same pathway that we followed, there is an opportunity for them to leapfrog. I mean, green hydrogen from Chile exported into Bolivia. I mean, they've got opportunities, but that's where I think the fairness is. How do we help them build the resilience to something they didn't cause, which is happening now?
Okay, Rachel, thank you. I should have said the way a ThinkIn is supposed to work is that it's like an open news meeting. It's like an editorial conference. And at the end of it, if you like, you're supposed to come out with a better informed point of view. You certainly wouldn't be blamed if you came away from this thinking, on the one hand, I'm overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. But personally, I come away encouraged by the shared sense of urgency. And it's really striking to me that a subject which just a matter of probably 2 or 3 years ago was debated over its validity is now fiercely argued over how quickly and effectively change is going to happen. At the end of a ThinkIn, it's typical for the editor, in this case, happily me, to try and say, okay, how do we string this together? I would say this. Firstly, I do think the conversation that I had touched on with Lars matters, which is this question of trust, or if we're talking about it more broadly, bad blood between consumers, corporates, and the political point that Jan made too. That said, I am also really struck by the fact that we all share a real fascination with the potential for tech, right? So hydrogen, the funding of things like, CCS. I saw there was a stream of discussion around solar. And if there's an argument around circularity, it's not about whether we do it, it's about how far it goes and how we make that happen. Those things that seem to me are really encouraging. I look too at this point about the role of the corporate, the role of business. I think there's a divide here that's not going to be bridged. There's some people who say, look, capitalism is fundamentally the problem, it's not going to fix this. And some people that say, no, capitalism could be reformed and regulated and it's going to be the engine for fixing this. And I don't think we should pretend away that difference is easily going to be bridged. But what is striking to me is that there is something fundamentally changing in the nature of the company that used to be, I'm going to fix my own house and what everybody else does is no longer my problem, to an expectation that you have a responsibility as a business to your whole supply chain, to your whole value chain, in fact, to the way in which you influence the behavior of customers too. And I think that there's also something really interesting, which is, if you're as old as I am, is significant, which is businesses arguing for government regulation, in some cases government taxation, and certainly pump-primed investment in government intervention. These things matter a good deal. The final thing I would say is I'm really struck by what Claire and Rachel said right at the beginning, which is the possibility of what's happening politically. And I suppose for us, a small newsroom trying to think through where can we weigh in, we can, I hope, make sure that we provide the people information so when you get to COP26, there's a reasonable set of expectations of what can be delivered in the meeting, but possibly as excitingly around the meeting. And so I hope that for everyone who's joined, not everyone will agree with the way I see it. This is intended to be a forum for civilized disagreement, but it is a system of organized listening. And what we've listened to in the commentary on the chat and what we've heard from Vinay and from Mark and from Rachel and from Judith and others, but in no small part, of course, from Claire Perry-O'Neill, from Lars Holmqvist, from Jan du Plessis, and from Rachel Kite, I hope has opened our mind to what's possible. Certainly I feel that way. So thank you for your time this evening. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Lars. And thank you, Claire. And thank you all for joining. Look forward to doing this again. We've got 11 months and 3 weeks until COP. Let's wrap our heads around how we make it work. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening.